Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so excited to have you guys here today. It's gonna be a good show today. It's Happy Tuesday, y'all. Welcome to AMA with LCJ. For those of you all who do not know, this is an opportunity for me to come in and we just have discussions. I have some amazing questions. I want to make sure that it is interactive as possible. So if you're watching and you have some questions, you have some comments, make sure you drop them in the chat. It's my way of being able to connect and make sure that you know that we're just here to have a good time, answer some questions, whatever that looks like. And so today's topic is gonna be a good one. It's kind of going along with I'd say the Halloween spirit, in terms of like, I wouldn't say Halloween spirit, but like the theme, right? Like right now, it's people are doing all the scary stuff, so I figured like why not talk about a scary topic, the scary topic of the haunting effects of a toxic workplace culture. And so I have some questions queued up. And so we're going to dive right in. But once again, if you have questions, if you have comments, I want to make this as interactive as possible. So don't be afraid to drop something in the chat. Don't be afraid to ask a question. It's an opportunity for us all to learn and grow together. So just say, hey, what's up? How are you doing? And we're going to hop right in. Yo, once again, I can listen to this whole vibe like all day. Love this track. All right, so we are talking about the haunting effects of toxic workplace culture. This kind of goes along the themes. If you haven't caught up and watched, we've been talking about various topics week over week over week. And even last week we talked about kind of demystifying AI as leaders. At first I was going to do another AI session, but I figured like let's pause and pivot. And let's discuss, what toxic work culture looks like and how we actually the strategies to combat that, because those things are just as important. Now, we're going to have some interesting questions lined up for today. Now, with each one of these questions, I will say my hope is that as you're coming in and you're thinking about it, sometimes when we talk about toxic work culture, I think people sometimes go to the extreme, right? So when you talk about toxic work culture, people think like the worst of the worst. But what I find is typically work cultures that are extremely toxic or have the ability to be toxic, it is very subtle. Okay. It is a very subtle signs. And there are a lot of these little things that pile up over time. And so it's important that as you're listening to this, one of the things is you may not work in a toxic work environment, but I think it's always important for us to be thinking about what that actually looks like in terms of having, ensuring that we don't develop a toxic workplace culture, right? So one of the things that we just want to even start off with in talking about, right, out of the gate. So what are some subtle signs of toxic workplace culture that people might actually overlook? Now, this one is really good. I want to just dive in right out of the bat with this one. And I'm going to list some things, and then we'll probably have some questions really around what does that look like, and then what are my thoughts around it. And once again, if you're watching live, make sure that you are put any comments, any questions in there. I'll be able to get to them as we go on. All right. So what are some of the subtle signs of what are some of the subtle signs of toxic workplace that people workplace culture that people might overlook? So I'm going to give you a list, right? Here are some subtle signs that I think get over, like once again, let's redirect. Microaggressions, any type of discrimination, harassment, all of those I think are the blaring red whistles that it is not a good place to work, right? When we talk about subtle, I think these are the little things that creep up that if they go unchecked can slowly morph their way into a part of your culture and become harder to see the toxicity of the system, right? So here we go, diving right in. So what are some of the subtle things that get overlooked when you're thinking about like, is my workplace toxic, right? Number one, this one is blaring. High turnover. If you have a high employee turnover, that is one of the signs that you may have an issue within your culture. Number two, lack of trust. When we think about trust, trust is really setting the cornerstone for how you're going to work together. And so when you have lack of trust, whether that's leaders not trusting um, employees or employees not trusting their leader, these are all brewing signs of really what it can be a fertile ground for toxic workforce or toxic workplace culture. Poor communication. Poor communication to me is a byproduct of lack of trust, right? Information hoarding, lack of transparency, not a lot of feedback, all pieces of the puzzle that can go into some of these subtleties or signs of a toxic culture. Clicks in it, exclusivity. Easy way to say that is in and out groups. What are those? In and out groups are, the people who get invited but don't get invited. People who are first to know, who don't know. I can tell you, like, probably one of the worst things is like when you're in a meeting and you find out about something that involves you for the very first time in a meeting. That's a good example of like in and out groups. So when you think about clicks and exclusivity, this is one of the things that can quickly erode trust, which can, like we just talked about, it's all kind of going downhill from there. And then no work-life balance, right? So a culture that really doesn't respect personal time, boundaries, all of those things, that these are kind of, I would say, more of the subtle signs that if we're not mindful, if we're not careful, as leaders, that can really put us in a situation where we are not vigilant enough, right? So, oh, it's not that bad, right? Yeah, we've got some communication issues. Yeah, we have some trust issues. There's some in and out things. There's some things that you're aware of, but if you're not careful, these subtle things over time is really what's going to erode your culture and then building up and priming the culture of toxicity, right? So you have to be really, really careful and vigilant. So those, I would say, are some of the subtle signs that either if you're not focused, if you're not aware, if you're not mindful of these things, that can really push you into like what would be a toxic work culture, right? Now, one of the things that I want to talk about is, we talked about some of this, the effects of toxic workplace culture. So one of the very first things I talked about was it's not even a not so subtle sign, which is high employee turnover, right? And so how does high employee turnover rates really affect the remaining team members? So if you have a turnover, and here's what I'll say, different industries have higher turnover rates, right? So like we can just acknowledge that as the fact. But when we think about the fact that if employees can't wait to leave, it's a red flag, right? As the common cliche, one of the common cliches I like to say, my dad was the first one who introduced me to it, but it's something I actually believe in, which is people don't leave jobs, people don't leave companies, people leave people, right? People leave leaders. And so when you have a turnover, especially I would say if you have a turnover of a certain group, right, that can start to really impact and affect what happens after the fact. And so a lot of times when you see people turning over, the impact that it can have for those team members who are left, it can start to wear down. It can become a really high level of mental fatigue, emotional fatigue, and I would say the consistent negativity. That's another piece of the puzzle. So you talk about like the side conversations, the online chats, the water cooler, all of the general moods, right? It becomes a more seated issue. And so when you think about how to look at your team member or your employee turnover rate, if you're not looking at that and examining that on a regular basis, I think it's important. And here's what I'll say. In a perfect world, everybody would say everybody stays in the company, right? Everybody stays in the company for a long time. We know that that's not necessarily fully the culture here. But I do think that it's important that if you are watching your turnover rates, if you have the metrics, you should be able to see and identify if a trend is happening. Are you seeing a large exit of early in career? Are you seeing a larger exit of women in a certain particular group? all of these things can start to indicate that there's something wrong. So what also happens is it signals, potentially, if you don't figure out how to stop that, it can easily signal to other team members who are remaining that you are complicit or you don't care. And you never want to have that, right? So, how you go about handling that is really, really important. And so, that may be time to do some pulse checks. It may be time to ramp up some one on ones. One of my favorite practices is senior leader listening sessions. I think a lot of times, when you see a group that is leaving in volume, it's important for senior leaders to listen and know and understand what's happening. Some companies, they like to shelter their senior leaders. And so what happens is there's this anomaly where, there's a bubble, right? And they're in the bubble, which I get, right? They're making bigger decisions and all of these things, but the responsibility is in the leadership. And so it's important for leadership to understand like what's going on, what's happening, whether that's skip level, whether that's C-suite level, whether that's higher up executives in the company, listening and understanding what's happening at the ground level and the impact it makes. And I'll give you a really good example of this, right? So if I'm a fan of Undercover Boss, I can watch it most of the time, right? So with Undercover Boss, a lot of times you have leaders who go in and they make these decisions about the organization, or they're hearing about them, but not really understanding the impact that it has down the line. And so they're removed from the day-to-day chatter. They're removed from like what's going on and what people are seeing or hearing or feeling. And oftentimes they're shocked, right? Like if you've ever watched an episode of Undercover Boss, what you'll find is, typically, they may be, having these one-off conversations with their employees. Typically, they're C-suite guys coming down or gals and coming down and talking and saying like, hey, how's it going? And, sometimes the sentiment is they'll say, hey, the higher ups, they don't care about us. And I think it's funny because what ends up translating in a lot of that, especially when you see companies that have higher turnover, is a lot of times these senior leaders are shocked. Right? They're like, we know we have high turnover. We think that we're doing the right thing. But if you're not in the shoes day to day, that's how you start to miss things. And then that negativity and everything else starts to build up. Not to mention, once again, the pressure that puts on those who choose to remain when you have higher turnover can, start to lead to, once again, like a worse like work-life balance and all of that, right? So that is one of the things that we have to think about and be vigilant. So just really quickly, once again, if you are joining me, thank you for joining. Feel free to put, comments in the chat. If you have questions, make sure you put those questions in there as well. This is going to be a really good session today on what we're looking for. So we're talking about the haunting effects of toxic workplace culture. So make sure that if you have questions, you let me know, and then we will hop in. I want to hear from you. How you're doing, all the things. And if you have questions on like what my experience or an experience, and we'd be able to be more than happy to answer those. All right. So one of the things that we talk about is one of the questions that I got around workplace culture and toxic workplace culture was, can I share some of my experiences where a lack of trust led to damaging consequences for the team? So here's what I'll tell you. When we talk about lack of trust leading to damaging consequences for the team, lack of trust or lack of trust is one of the most damaging things to workplace culture, to your team, to your objectives, to your goals. If you do not have trust is the cornerstone of any functional, high-performing culture and organization. I don't care what anybody says. Here's the deal. I ain't got to like you, but I have to trust you. People don't always like you. They're not always going to like the decisions you make. They're not always going to agree with everything that you're saying. But once you have people lose trust in you as a leader, if someone loses, the team is losing trust with each other, or they're losing trust in the organization, it is a fast track to nowhere and lack of productivity and lack of performance. So, I think Stephen Covey writes a book like Speed of Trust, right? And because some people lead with trust, some people believe that trust has to be earned, and you have to know where you are in that scenario, right? And when I think about how lack of trust has been damaging, and I've seen consequences for the team. One of the big pieces of the puzzle is with lack of trust. Um, you start to, like, people don't go all in, right? That's one of the consequences I've seen. People start to, we talked about, like, what communications start to happen when trust barriers are being ebbing and flowing. You will also start to see when trust starts to wane, how decisions are made, what decisions are made in groups, and out groups start to form based on trust lines, right? When I think about how we have to deal with trust, or how we look at trust as leaders in organizations, it should be very high on your list. Very, very high on your list. Because without trust, it becomes very difficult to steer the ship, right? Like, one of the things, when I was leading a team, here's what I know. My team trusted me. And if I told the team to scrub the deck, they'd scrub the deck. And whether they agreed or not with why we were scrubbing the deck or when they had to scrub the deck, they trusted me enough to know that I would not steer them wrong. And I think that in and of itself yielded a higher amount of productivity and being able to move the needle and trusting. And also, when you have a high amount of trust, you talk about feedback, being able to give feedback, being able to really pour into your talent the way that you need to really develop them and get them to the next level and getting them performing. All this boils down to trust. Show me a toxic organization, and I will show you an organization that is lacking trust. Trust in leader, trust in organizations, lack of trust in leaders, lack of trust in organization, lack of trust within each other. It becomes very hard. And so you don't know, you don't question. And so, like, one of the things that I think, sorry about that, I had to adjust there. One of the things that I think about, how do you build trust? This isn't even one of my questions, but let's talk about it. How do you build trust? Time. For some people, it's time. For some people, it is, they got to have the receipts. They've got to see over time that you display a level of trust, right? Like, hey, I've seen them make really good decisions. I've seen them advocate for me, right? I've seen them go to bat. Like, one of the things, that at least for me, how I built trust, I feel like I built trust very fast in my team, and my team was a growing team at times. It was an evolving team. How I built trust was, what I will say is, wild transparency. I would be as transparent as I could, right? Because as leaders, you can't always just sprawl out and lay out all the things, right? You can't. There are certain times where you are not able to disclose certain things. Certain information may be embargoed for a certain amount of time as far as what you can actually communicate. But I would communicate as much as I could when I could with my team members. What's the word I'm looking for? I would do that whether I agreed sometimes with the decision or not. But I think it's like, hey, here's what the decision was. Here's why this decision was made. Here's how we're going to respond accordingly. And I think it allows people to process things a lot better, right? So building trust comes, I think, from transparency. I think building trust, another way, is being authentic and bringing your best self to work, the authenticity. Now, some people take authenticity to a whole nother level. So I do believe that it's about bringing your, people say whole self, best self. I'd say best self to work. Excuse me. So I broke one of my cardinal rules, which is like not eating before these things, but life, such is life. So that's one of the things you have to think about. How do you build trust? Trust is a cornerstone in building making sure that you are counteracting any ability that toxicity creeps in. And that here's the other thing that I think is really important with trust. The other way that you build trust is you address issues as they come up. Don't because and here's the thing, leaders, I'm talking to leaders right now. So if you're watching and you're a leader, I need you to hear me out on this. This is very, very, very important. Leaders, if a team member, employee comes to you with an issue, you don't have to agree. You don't have to do something and respond. Your number one responsibility is to listen, empathize, understand, and then respond. Now, sometimes the response is not doing anything. But when you're building trust, as you build trust as a leader, sometimes team members just want to feel heard, right? And sometimes it's not always about going in and actually changing things or being, sometimes you just don't have the ability. Sometimes it is what it is, right? And so you can't always alter that scenario or that outcome. But in the fact that you're willing to listen, you're willing to empathize, you're willing to understand, and then respond, builds trust. If you don't feel like it's a big deal and then you treat it like it's not a big deal and you throw it off, that's one of the fastest ways that you can lose trust with a team member. Don't take it seriously, right? Or trying to explain it away. So I think those are some things that are really, really, I would say, really, really important in terms of that. Now, I will say y'all are quiet today. So just let me know if there are any other questions. If you got questions, make sure that you're dropping them in the chat. I want to be able to connect and respond and figure out how we can, if there's some ways that I can answer some questions for you all. All right. So let's keep it rolling. Let's keep this conversation going. And there we go. I lost my page there for a second. So what are some communication red flags that signal a toxic culture? What are some communication red flags that signal that there is a toxic culture? I think that there's a couple. One of my favorites is information hoarding. Right? Somebody has information, doesn't share information openly and freely. They're trying to hold out and try to get themselves an advantage. Or I like to say selective dissemination of information. And I think back to transparency. Transparency is going to be a big key piece of that. So anytime you're seeing team members withhold information from each other or not including people in the meetings, not thinking through who's going to be impacted by those decisions, I think that's where you can really kind of worry about, hey, there may be some information hoarding or selective dissemination of information. And those are some red flags, right? If somebody goes in, well, I didn't even know, like somebody made this decision without me and I didn't know, like those are red flags that you need to be aware of. And how do you, my biggest thing, back to James Clear, right? You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. So how do you do that? You think about what in the system broke that person didn't know, that there was a lack of communication or communication wasn't being shared. And so when you know or understand that and you figure out where the system is broken, I think you can start to address it a lot faster and ahead. And that can really help with some communication red flags, I would say, that exist within a toxic culture, right? Okay. So one of the things that we talked about, it's almost like a building block. We're building a building here. And you all are quiet today. I may actually get through all my questions. I may get through all my questions before you guys even say anything. What's up, y'all? Like, let me know. Questions, agree, disagree, all the things. I'd love to hear from you. So one of the questions is how can cliques or in groups form in an organization and what can they do? So let's just really quickly define like cliques or in groups and out groups, right? There's something to be said about in groups and out groups. So when you think about like a clique or an in group, out group, it is typically like if you've ever been on a team. Actually, let me rewind. The best way I can explain, I like to explain like in groups is out groups, is like when you're picking teams, like go back to primary school, elementary school, and you're picking teams, right? And let's just say it's basketball. right? And in basketball, there can only be like, there has to be an even number, like 3-on-3, 4-on-4, 5-on-5, right? Typically it stops at 5. And there's an odd number of you. And so people start picking teams and picking people. And you may be the last person to go, and or you're not picked at all. And that to me, I think is a really good example of possibly like the emotional side or the mental toll that it can take on somebody who is not um when you think about in and out groups, right? Like it's that person who's being picked last or not at all. And I think that it can be the impact that that can have on team members is, one, they can feel less valued, they can feel less part of the team. um it can boil down to, when you're not mindful of in and out groups, then you'll start to see biased decision making. And that can be detrimental to a program, it could be detrimental to an organization. So when you start to think about some of those things, about the importance of not having cliques and in and out groups, this is where that comes, right? It goes back to trust. It goes back to um building team communication skills and all of that. And so if you have one person or two people of a team that are always on the outs, your team is not going to be as strong as it is. Within my team, here's what I'll tell you. Within my team, my goal was to never have clicks and in and out groups. Now, do I have like, and here's the thing. Leaders, and the higher up you get in organizations, you'll find this often. Typically, leaders will have a group that is maybe more senior, that they can bounce ideas off of, figure things out in what order that information is getting disseminated. That's a real thing. Or you have a chief of staff where you bounce those things off of, because they may have a pulse on the team as well, that you may not be necessarily privy to, things you want to be thinking about. All of those things happen. But when you think about like in and out groups specifically, those are the ones that become, and I'm not talking about like hierarchy, right? Because sometimes your junior people don't need to know what your senior people need to know versus your middle. That's not what I'm talking about. Hey, we're all going to lunch and we're going to leave you out. Everybody knew this but you. And then you find out after the fact. These are all things that I think really can play and take a toll on the mental health of your team members if this is happening. One of the things that, oh man, I'm thinking like, this is going to be another great resource. I'm actually going to make a note. I'm going to take my pen out and make a note of it now, which is when I think about the first 90 days you have a team member, right? As a team member, as you are bringing in someone into an organization, when you're bringing someone in onto a team, one of the greatest questions that you can ask somebody is, hey, how do you feel? How are you feeling? How do you feel like you're meshing with the team? What does this look like? So there's a whole series of questions that you can ask somebody, really, I would say at that 30-day mark, that 60-day mark, that 90-day mark, that can really help not create these in and out groups. And I get it. Some people will purposely put themselves on the outs, right? Everybody knows that one person, like, I'm just here to work. I don't want to talk to nobody. Just give me my work. Let me do my thing and I'm out. Right? I get that. There's still a level of it, but you have to have a level of team cohesiveness. And that's really what you're trying to combat when you think about cliques and in and out groups, right? How does this person mesh with the team? How do they work well? What does that look like? I think you've seen it in sports over and over and over again in sports all the time, where you have that one person who sticks out like a sore thumb, and then you're like, what's what? Like, can't get it. So those are things that I think really, really matter. Okay, so I got a question. I'm trying to get it for whatever reason. LinkedIn wasn't letting me get it. Hold on. How do you handle a situation where trust? It's so funny. Like, I see it, but I can't get all of it. Hold on. Jessica, I see your question. It's just not coming through my feed for whatever reason. Hold on. Let's see. Let's make this smaller. Sorry about that, y'all, because I want to make sure I get this question because it's a good question. It says, like, basically, how do you handle How do you handle psychological safety is what I believe if I'm reading this right. How do I handle a situation where psychological safety or trust, I think, has been broken? Let me know if this is the right question, Jess, and I'll make sure I get it. Hey, Jana, what's good? So, Jess, that's a good question. How do I handle a situation where trust or psychological safety, I believe, is what she's saying, has been broken? So one of the biggest pieces. There we go. I got it now. Whoop, whoop. Okay, here we go. Had to go to the mobile. Okay. How do I handle a situation where trust or psychological safety issues are coming from outside of your team? Ooh, okay. Okay, here we go. I got it. So, how do you handle a situation where trust or psychological safety issues are coming from outside the team? So how would I handle that? What does that look like? I think it's context, right? Um, I've been in a situation where you have I would say, we'll call it your nuclear team, right? That's the team that I have, that I manage, that like I'm responsible for. And that group is tight. Trust is not an issue. Psychological safety is not an issue, right? We're good. Bet. Done, right? But then you have to work across with another nuclear team with a different leader and another nuclear team with a different leader. And that is where lack of trust and psychological safety are existing. I will tell you one of the things that I have done. I will go back to what I said earlier, which is when it goes to communication, open communication, transparency, authenticity. There have absolutely been times where I've had to go to a leader and say, yo, leader, and this is literally real talk. This is just, if you work with me, you can attest to this. I'll be like, yo, what's up, leader? Hey, here's the deal. Talking with my team, this scenario happened. This is what's going on. I want us to be able to make sure that we're working and we're getting great results. You know, we're working collaboratively across our teams because you have stakeholders in order to get things done, right? Here's the impact that this is having on my team. How do you think we can go about doing this? What does that look like? And so sometimes it would be taking both of our teams and sticking them in a meeting together after we've discussed and made the lines clear. Sometimes I think what happens, or I've seen what happens when there's lack of trust or psychological safety outside of a team, outside of your actual team, it usually is because there's a gray area where swim lanes have not been well defined, right? And so because swim lanes have not been very well, they haven't been defined very well. People are tripping over each other, fumbling. I thought I had this. You thought you had this. I thought I had a level of autonomy that they thought I had a level of autonomy. And so there's a lot of gray area. And in the gray, in deciding and making decisions that impact each other or the teams or the project autonomously, right? That's kind of where a lot of that comes from, right? And I think that, you know, the more that you can just put it out there and have the conversation, Jess, I think is really where I think that's going to be the most important piece of the puzzle, at least for me. But great question. Jana says, or there may be a fear of something or someone. Yeah. I mean, I think you see this. I think you see this a lot. Fear of something or someone, especially as you're working in organizations that either, whether it's an owner, a business leader, C-suite person, where fear of something or someone, that's where that comes from. But typically, here's the other thing I find. Let me explain something to you guys. One of the things that I've seen in leadership is sometimes things aren't always about us. When you see people struggling, sometimes even with communication, trust, psychological safety, how we're responding and creating a safe environment, that fear of something or someone sometimes doesn't even come from us. Sometimes it comes from unresolved issues from their personal lives. Sometimes it comes from unresolved issues or things that they've had from a previous leader. I think one of the things that I would say I have found is, as a leader, it goes back to spending time, understanding, getting a better gauge for how you can better equip and build this culture. You know, like one of the things that, you know, it's funny because like I feel oftentimes as leaders, like you're part counselor, part cat wrangler, part, excavator, like you're having to do all of these things. And so it's really helping people uncover the things, right? So if I recognize that somebody may be struggling with fear of something or someone, it's okay to ask like, okay, hey, where did you like, okay, hey, I'm actually afraid of telling. Okay, so what? Tell me what happened. Did something happen? Well, no. Okay, well, what was your experience? And then you're able to actually kind of put things out in the front, and then figure out how to move from there. So it's really important as leaders that, sometimes this lack of trust and all of these things don't even stem from us. It can stem from one like other people, other things. And that is, I would say, one of the tougher parts of leadership, because sometimes there aren't things that you can do. But your job is to really kind of figure out how to get the best out of that person every single time. How do you excavate? How do you get that person to really actualize their potential in that role within the organization with the objectives and the goals that you have to reach? And that can be tough. It can be tough. For sure. Tough for sure. All right. Okay, so let's ask another question. Let's see what we got going on here. Speaking of which, I think this one actually kind of really rolls nicely into what I was talking about just a second ago, which is like, what are some effective ways to encourage employees to provide honest feedback? Well, I think I even talked about this like a couple of weeks ago. Like, so what are some effective ways to encourage employees to provide honest feedback? So, one of the ways that you can start to really combat, like making sure that you don't have a toxic work culture and the effects of it, is asking for honest feedback. Now, there's a caveat with this. Um, when you ask, be prepared to sometimes hear things you don't want to hear, or you're going to be able to see things that you didn't know or you didn't recognize. One of the hardest things, and I had to learn this even as a leader, one of the hardest things is not to take feedback personal, right? Because you pride yourself on your work and the team and all the things that you're doing and how because you give a lot as a leader, right? You give a lot, you give a lot, you give a lot, you give a lot, right? And so sometimes when you get the feedback that is less than favorable, or it's not what you wanted to hear, you gotta work on your heart a little bit and not to take it personal, because I think sometimes when we do that, it actually impedes the ability just to continue to build trust and go from there. One of my favorite things I like to explain to leaders is this. Um, when you think about um, when you get feedback and how you get feedback and how you accept feedback, it is not about your intention. It is all about your impact. Not about your intention. It is all about your impact, right? The path to hell is paved with good intentions. One of my favorite sayings, right? In other words, as a leader, we can often intend for things to be, appear, perceive, emote. You may be trying to do something the best way that you know how, or what you're trying to relay or get from your people, but the impact wasn't what you got. And as leaders, the biggest piece of that puzzle is how do you get honest feedback? It's when you get feedback, especially feedback that's not favorable, or you don't agree with, or you struggle with, is your first thing to do is defend. It is what it is. That's part of communication for those of us who've been in any type of relationship. You can go friendships, you can go marriage, relationships, partnerships, whatever you want to call it, right? It's not about what you intend. It is absolutely how that person perceived it. You have a responsibility as the communicator. Once it leaves your lips, you can't control anything else that happens with it, or whatever's happening as a result of that. Your thing is to take feedback. Lisa Nichols, one time I heard her say this, and it really shifted and changed a lot for me. She said, there's a level of freedom, and I think you have to be operating with the mindset, especially in leadership, of freedom, when it says you have nothing to hide, nothing to lose, nothing to defend, and nothing to protect. And I think one of the things that that really shaped me, I think, as a leader, I was an entrepreneur the first time when I heard her talk about that. But when you think about it, I think it frees you up from always feeling like you have to defend or protect yourself from whatever the thing is, right? And when I've shifted my mindset with that, I think it helped a lot, especially as a leader. Like, I don't have to defend it. I just have to listen and understand and say, okay, like, thank you for the feedback. That's one of the things I always tell my team. Like, it doesn't matter, even if I had agreed with it or not, it's important that you say, hey, thanks for the feedback. That little thing, just that little tweak can build trust. Hey, thank you for the feedback. Thank you for your honesty. Because what you want a team that trusts you. You want teams that work together trusting and that they have honest conversations. Because if you don't, when things get bad, they won't say anything to you. And then you're going to look up and be like, I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened. I'm trying to figure it out. Why is this happening? Why didn't you come to me sooner? All of these things, all of that stems from, how you perceive or take feedback as a leader, right? Once again, you don't have to agree. You don't have to agree. It's not my job to agree. My job is to listen, respond, understand, be empathetic, take the feedback and go. So how do you figure that out? You want honest feedback from your team members, take it seriously, and then respond. If you want it, and you want honest feedback. I want honest feedback. It's not, like I said, it's honest feedback is hard and it's not easy. And it can be really tough. But I think when you're able to do that and you don't respond, like you just don't react, you listen, wait, and then respond. I think that that's where a lot of the magic can start to happen. And you will be able to get more honest feedback from your team members. And before I go on, I'll say this one thing about feedback and honest feedback. It can become very easy for organizations and teams when you receive feedback to try to explain it away. Okay? You get feedback. You hear the thing, you get feedback, you hear it all, right? All the things, you get it. And then you'd be like, well, they just said that because of this, or they were responding because of they're responding or they're reacting because of this. And so therefore I can explain or justify the thing. And that is very detrimental to your organization, to your culture. I would probably sit in the camp of, it doesn't matter the catalyst of the response, right? Because I think you're seeing that a lot with a lot of tech companies, a lot of companies who've downsized. There's several companies who are, talking about, hey, like morale is low, engagement is low, turnover is still happening high, even though the market isn't there. All of these things that are happening, right? And you could say, hey, we know that because of these things, we're going to see a lower ENPS score, an employee net promoter score, right? We're going to see that team members are less happy. But what would happen? What could happen if you just took it at face value and responded appropriately? What could that do? What would that do for your organization? What would that do for your team members? Because the reality is, it doesn't matter what the catalyst was, it was their response. And so you have to take those responses as seriously as anything else, right? And that's really what I think when we think about honest feedback, because if they don't start to see the changes, you're going to get less and less feedback anyways. You're not going to get the honest feedback and go from there, right? Those are the things that I think about in terms of that. Good question. Let me know if any other questions in the chat. I want to make sure. Jana said, really great point. Love that. And opportunities to grow all day. Those are really, really important pieces of the puzzle. Let me know if you have any other questions. I know we're down to the last 15 minutes. I want to make sure that if you have questions around, workplace culture, building culture, what does that look like? How can I help you? What questions do you have? And thank you all so much for joining. And it's not lost on me. I hope this is helping you all. in every way. All right, so one of the things that I want to make sure that I know we've talked a lot about kind of what this looks like, but what I don't want to do is leave you empty handed. And so when we talk about employee feedback, one of the biggest things is making sure that you're just asking, that you're asking for regular feedback and you're giving regular feedback. And I think that those are some key pieces of the puzzle. So one of the things that I think about in terms of this is, can I discuss, it's a great question. Can I discuss the role of regular one-on-ones in identifying and remedying any workplace, remedying toxic workplace elements or culture? So regular one-on-ones, I like to do two. I had typically as a leader, I had two different types of one-on-ones. I had those that were standing typically when my team was smaller, it was, sometimes it'd be like 45 minutes. And then as my team got larger, I dropped them down to 30 minutes. Because typically my one-on-ones would run over. And then what would happen is in between one-on-ones, I would like to do what I call drive-bys or check-ins, right? And so really the role of the role of having, man, that's like that is a tongue twister. The role of having regular one-on-ones is this. It allows you to check in beyond the work. So when I think about one-on-ones, I think there's a couple of things. It's like check-in number one. Hey, how are you doing? How's your work? Is there anything you need? We talk about any feedback that I'm getting, any feedback that they have for me where they may need help or they may need me to help and intervene or think through a problem. That's really how I utilize those one-on-ones. That's really what one-on-ones are centered around. If you go into your one-on-ones with your team, or if your team member and your leader only discusses work, pivot. It's really, really important in your regular one-on-ones that it's not just, hey, yo, what's going on? Let's talk about work. So project A, what's up with this? How's, are you on time? It becomes all business, because what ends up happening is, remember, part of what we said, right? How do you combat toxic workplace culture? Trust. How do you build trust? Time. How you build that over time is really getting to know your team members, understanding what their motivations are, what's ticking, what's working well, what's not. All of those things are the building blocks. And so one-on-ones really do help remedy and help you make sure that you are not, you're aware that if you start to see the signs of a toxic work culture, one-on-ones are really great places to catch that, right? Hey, I'm working on this project, but I'm struggling with this person. Or, hey, I'm working on this project and I'm struggling with this stakeholder outside of your team, right? These are all things that you're able to identify and hear and be able to respond before you're able to respond and not react, right? And I think that is the key as far as having regular one-on-ones and check-ins. Checking in on the person, how they're doing, how their world is, what's going on. So I would say typically, depending on kind of where that person is, I'd say in their project cycles and what's going on, none of my one-on-ones were the same, right? So sometimes it may be, I'd come into a one-on-one and I'd say, hey, hey, how are things going? Just a quick check. We might have just had a call, so I already know how their project is doing. So my one-on-one may be more geared towards them, their development, any areas of opportunity, and going from there. It may be less work focused because I might have gotten updates and already know how their projects are going, right? In another case, I may have a different one-on-one with the team member. I was like, oh, actually, I haven't had an update. So I may shorten some of that time about hey, all of, I wouldn't say pleasantries, but hey, how's that person doing? Making sure not all of that one-on-one time is going towards catching up, but really making sure that I'm getting an understanding of what's going on, what's working in the world, what's not, and then going from there. Now, the other hack to all of this is these drive-by check-ins, right? And what I would do as a leader is typically my day, I had 2 blocks of time. Typically the first block of time always got hijacked but I was pretty good about the second block of time. So I had from 11 to 1 was blocked out, and then from 3 to 5 was blocked out. 11 to 1 typically just gave me wiggle room if needed, but then I always made sure I had an hour for lunch. It's important, leaders, that self-care is so important. So I typically always made sure I had an hour for lunch. I tried not to always have a lunch where I'm eating at the desk, but I'm getting up, stretching, getting time to think. You'd be amazed by taking an hour lunch, leaders, specifically what that does as far as ideation, ideas, all those things, just getting away, unplugging for a minute. It just kind of breathe some fresh air and get refresh and ideas that come. Like, here in Texas, I'm in Texas, so it was 4,000 degrees quite for quite some time, so it became a little difficult. But sometimes I'd like to go on a walk, and then I just go for a walk on my lunch. So I'd eat lunch and then go for a walk for 30 minutes, and then be able to really come back and see things a lot clearer, or really or kind of be refreshed. But that 3 to 5 block is when I would come in and I would just check in with the team. I would like, oh, actually, I hadn't talked to Chris. Okay, what's up, Chris? I haven't. Hey, what's going on? I may catch it there, but hey, there's nothing. I just want to do a quick check-in. How are things going? Let me know if you got a second to chat. Not urgent, right? Because sometimes when your manager pings you, people freak out, right? And that is one of the things that I would do is you'd be like, yeah, what's up? Hey, how are things going? Like, just a quick drive by, check in. And sometimes those are like 5 minutes, 5 to 15 minutes. Sometimes they end up being 30 minutes, but those are the things that will breathe fresh air into your team as well, right? Or these kind of informal drive-bys, if you will, that I would do over time. Jana says, even a small break per hour, the neuroscience behind it. Yeah. I mean, even the small breaks per hour, I am a big fan of, I would start the meeting at 5 after. So moving more towards 25-minute meetings, 50-minute meetings, less of like back to back to back calls. I was never a fan of back to back calls because it was just become so draining, and you're just like, the ROI over time actually decreases, I think, faster. So those are things that I think about as far as like identifying ways to make sure that you are fostering a healthy culture. These one-on-ones are pivotal, imperative, right? That you do that. And depending on the size of your team will depend on how often you have the ability to do it. But this is where these, I would call them drive-by check-ins, really do start to add up and can help, put those deposits into the team that carry them over into the one-on-ones. A lot of people do, some people do daily huddles or daily stand-up meetings for 15 minutes with the teams. That works as well. Those are all little hacks that you can figure out how to just continue to do this. Now, here's what I'll tell you. Before we go, before we head out, I'm really passionate about this culture thing, because everything that you're trying to achieve in an organization will come down to your culture. Peter Drucker has a quote. I love it. It says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So when you have organizations that do not have healthy cultures, or do not take their health, like the health of their culture, seriously, right? Or be willing to explain it away, you can't out strategize that. There's not a strategy. There's not a playbook. There's not a program. There's not anything that you can actually do that will out strategize poor culture. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. I can't stress this enough. So when you talk about high performing teams, when you talk about making sure that you are building and growing your business or your organization, if you are not talking about culture, it's a fool's game. It's a fool's game. You have to hold it as you are looking at your strategy, your sales strategy, when you're looking at your marketing strategy, when you are looking at operationally what you're doing and where that operational rigor, if culture is not one of those pillars, you're playing the wrong game. Find me an organization that is not crushing it at culture, and then who isn't crushing it on the P&L. Just find me. I give you an example. I can give you an example. Matter of fact, I'm going to close it out with this example. Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays because of their culture. That's what matters to them. That they're, they are a faith, if you go back and you read, Chick-fil-A is a faith-based organization. The essence of Chick-fil-A, I need to find their mission statement. Chick-fil-A is very serious about their culture, right? And here it is. So we're gonna read. I'm just because I got it. I'm gonna put it here. I gotta because I think this is a really good example, right? Of so here we go. Here we go. Chick-fil-A, right? So one of the things is their purpose, their organization, their culture, everything that they're doing. So they talk about the business is based on biblical principles he believed were also good business principles, right? And so their corporate purpose was guided, has guided all that they do. It says we keep our purpose front and center because it helps us to steward our business and our work to positively influence everyone we meet. Okay, stay with me. Stay with me. I'm going somewhere with this. All right. So when they talk about it, he says, at the end of the day, this is their purpose, is to glorify God by being a faithful steward of all that was entrusted to us, to have a positive influence on all who come in contact with Chick-fil-A. This was the purpose. This is what Truist's legacy, what he wanted to leave. We are focused on creating a culture of care, both at the support center and in their restaurants. So they created a culture of care. Okay. Tell me, I'm not even trying to be funny. I don't think I've ever had a bad customer experience at Chick-fil-A. Ever. I've been at Chick-fil-A a lot because the culture is there, right? And so then you go in, so they talk about this culture right? So they believe that a strong and caring culture is essential to their success in offering fulfilling careers for their staff. The notion of care applies not only to the franchise operators and their team members and customers in our restaurant, but also to how they treat each other at the support center. They're committed to a workplace culture where everyone's treated with honor, dignity, and respect, and their policies, practices, benefits support this goal. Huh! Come on, somebody. Y'all, okay, I know I'm about to go over, but it's totally fine. But if you notice, it said that their workplace culture is where everyone is treated with honor, dignity, and respect, and their policies and practices and benefits support that goal. Everything that they do supports their culture where everyone is treated with honor, dignity, and respect. Y'all, I could do a whole sermon on Chick-fil-A. Real talk. This is really how they go. So when you think about the culture, they have a culture of care and all of these things. So when you think about Chick-fil-A, so here's the thing. Chick-fil-A is one of the most popular and profitable fast food chains in the US. Right? One of the most profitable. Right? It's not just about sales, because sales is one thing, but profit is another. Right? So if you think about it, they're only second to McDonald's, but McDonald's has 50,000 more stores than them. But they're a fast climber, right? And so when you think about how much they look so here, put it to you this way. Let's put it to you this way. Chick-fil-A is just behind McDonald's and Starbucks. They're behind Starbucks. They're behind McDonald's and they're behind Starbucks in profit, but they're closed one day a week. They're closed one day of a week. Right? Just think about that. They're that profitable and they're closed. When have you what? Imagine if they were open 7 days a week. And I think I could easily foresee them going well beyond, right, some of these other companies because of the culture that they carry, right? Okay, I'm off my high horse uh when when it comes to this, but I will say it is by far one of the most highly profitable fast food franchises, right? With franchisees netting more than most other organizations. And I think it goes to say that there's a lot when it comes to how they create a culture and how the culture then dictates everything else that they're doing. Culture matters. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Okay. So that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll be back next week. We'll see what comes of that, what I'll be talking about. But I appreciate it so much for joining me. It's been fun. I'm headed out. I want you guys to remember, be awesome, make a difference. Have a great week. Peace.